You're listening to Overwatch Contenders Daily, your path to daily news, scores, and insights into the Overwatch League stars of tomorrow. Here's your host, LemonKiwi.
Hey Overwatch fans, hope you're having a wonderful Wednesday. It's halfway through the week, that means halfway to the weekend, and that's all that matters. So this is Overwatch Contenders Daily. I'm LemonKiwi. Today's episode will be covering the EU Open Division playoffs that occurred this past weekend. And while you're here, if you're curious about the NA Open Division playoffs, well, I covered that in Monday's episode, so you can check that out after. But today's interview, two fantastic guests, and actually this is my first interview with two guests at the same time. So it is Blank and HamTornado, the casters that were casting the grand final for the EU Open Division, and you've probably seen their faces around in the community casting all your amateur tournaments. Well, they're here to discuss the Northern Lights versus Samsung Morning Stars Blue Grand Final and other fun things about the EU playoffs. But before we get into my interview with those guys, let's go over some Contenders news. So first off, Detonator Korea, so those were the winning team for the Pacific region Contenders, so that org disbanded, so leaving a spot in Contenders up for sale. And that's when a Korean organization by the name of EXL Gaming came in and bought that spot. So they haven't released who their roster is yet or who they're interested in, but I'm sure that'll come out soon. And then the old players from Detonator Korea, I think, have found new teams, so we'll see who's going to be in Contenders next season. Number 2, Overwatch Pit has announced their third season, so the event will take place on May 31st to June 12th, and will be two separate tournaments for EU and NA, where 8 teams each, and these include lots of familiar faces from Contenders teams to top Open Division teams, so I'm super excited to check that out. But that's it for the news. Let's get into my interview with HamTornado and Blank about the EU Open Division playoffs. So I'm here with two awesome, fantastic, fabulous guests. You probably recognize them from Broadcast GG if you watch the Open Division that happened this weekend. I'm here with Evie, HamTornado, who is Open Division caster, analyst, and Broadcast GG project manager, and Zander, Blank, Munro, also Open Division caster and analyst. So how's it going, guys? How was the weekend?
Weekend was good. Tiring, right? We were casting for like 16 hours a piece. I mean, Ham's over there. Showing off a mustache. Luckily, I already have one, so that's so bad for me.
You're just making me jealous over here, bro. I gotta like up my facial hair game.
She's trying to grow it out as hard as she can.
Gotta prepare myself.
Tough.
For the viewers out there that might have missed Open Division, I hope you didn't, because these guys were the ones casting the grand finals for the European region for Open Division, but the 4 teams that made it to trials, Northern Lights, Samsung Morning Stars Blue, that's a mouthful, 1 point, and Augmented Authority. But Ham, I'm just going to call you Ham, and I'm going to call you Blank. Let's go by the gamer tags or the battlements, or aliases, from the 16 teams that enter playoffs. For Europe, did you guys see any surprises or upsets? What did you guys think?
I guess like there wasn't too many surprises because I think the main thing for us, me and Ham at least, was like Samsung Blue. They came in as a first seed, right? But they were relatively untested coming to playoffs. So when they came in, we didn't really know how they were going to perform despite being the first seed. Either way, they got all the way to the end. I think one of the minor things that was kind of as upset was Kurd Narwhals, because obviously they've been invited recently to Overwatch Pit, which was announced today. So they were kind of expected to go a lot further than they actually did.
Yeah, Kurd Narwhals actually got knocked into the losers bracket, I think in round 2. Yeah, they dropped to Northern Lights, so that's a little bit unlucky. Yeah, so certainly a strong team that we saw in T3. Not only that we saw in like Open Division, we've been following them, but also through like Go4s, Heroes of Anonymous, any of those other European T3 tournaments. So kind of unexpected that they would drop so early, but yeah. Other than that, though, like Blank said, not too many startling matchups.
Yeah, I was kind of looking at the bracket, and compared to NA, where like NA had 12 and 13 seeds, like getting to the finals, while as in EU, it's mostly all the higher seeds seem to have gotten the farthest. But was there maybe any teams outside of the top 16 that you guys might have thought would have made to playoffs but didn't?
I
I know I put you guys on the spot.
I think
brains. Dopamine, I think, might have been one of the
Yeah.
in contention for going up. They had won like Go For, ESL's Go For before in the past. Royal Rotor, I think, in fact, which is what made it so startling. But I think they just missed the cut, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, they didn't quite make it.
All right. Yeah. It's unfortunate. I mean, there's so many, hundreds of teams. I don't even know how big the EU bracket was
Like
compared to
1,000.
NA, but
It was
crazy.
oh,
it was actually 1,800 teams. I remember
Ooh.
almost 2,000 teams.
Damn.
oh wow.
But it was actually really interesting. NA was like 1,000 something teams signed up, but we retained like 700, 800 of them. But EU had like 1,800 teams sign up and only about 1,000 actually participated. So the numbers are like,
Wow, that's actually quite
Mhm.
comparable.
Yeah, so-
of the
yeah,
amount
in
of
the end,
teams.
the amount of teams that played were about the same.
Well, I learned something today. But let's get into the grand finals, though. Northern Lights, and I'm going to call it just Morning Stars, just to get the mouthful a little bit smaller. But Northern Lights versus Morning Stars in the winners final, kind of similar to the NA situation. Winners final dropped down to losers, and then they refaced each other in the grand finals to beat them twice. So could you guys, but first, give us a rundown of the two grand finalists for the viewers that don't know much about
Yeah,
them?
so Northern Lights and Samsung Morning Stars Blue. Northern Lights are a pretty young team, if I remember correctly, only like maybe a few weeks old, like a couple months perhaps.
2
Samsung,
months. That's
2
what
months.
they went.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Samsung, they're actually an Italian team, or they're an Italian team. They have a sister team, Samsung Morning Stars Black, as well, who was doing quite well in EU Open Div, but they got knocked out of eventually as well. So yeah, but Samsung Morning Stars Blue, this is a pretty good lineup that we see coming through. A lot of names that will be familiar to people who have been following Overwatch for a while. Line Pro, excuse me, a former pro player. Dance as well, his support player previously of Kongdu Unsia. Yeah, and Northern Lights, I'm personally a little bit less familiar with. Blank, I think, knows quite a few of the players though.
Yeah. So
Break it down, Blake.
I'm gonna get right in there. We're gonna dismantle. So Northern Lights, they're a good team there, but they've not been together as long. Like they've only been together like 2 months, like Ham was saying. But thing is, these guys, they're all coming from different teams, so they've all had team experience beforehand. So when they came together, they kind of gelled a little bit easier, despite Samsung Morning Stars Blue being like the older team in this case. But one thing to note is both teams do scrim 6 times a week. So there's not as much history to Northern Lights. However, they're known in the tier 3 scene, Latex, all these kind of players. They're very well situated, so to speak. So they're a solid team, and people were chanting for them at least.
That Shanghai Dragons scrim schedule. I hope it's been clearly working.
Yeah.
But to get into the nitty-gritty of the details of the grand finals, or actually, let's start with the winners finals, where actually Morning Stars were up 2-1 at one point, and then it suddenly became a game 5, where it, how do I say, Northern Lights forced a game 5 and won. It was kind of a turnaround in that situation. Then they dropped to losers, and in the grand finals, they faced each other again. Where unfortunately wasn't as close, at least in the scoreline, if you just look at that, as it was, I believe, 4-1, where the Morning Stars won the grand finals 4-1. I apologize. But I want to talk to you guys about the striking issues that you saw between the two teams.
Yeah, so coming into this, like, we already had like pre-thoughts on the matchup that was coming to it, because obviously Northern Lights, we tower them to be this heavy dive team, still playing a lot to that 2 dive meta with that Winston Diva, and then you've got your diver like a Tracer coming in there, as well as in this case we actually saw Riverboat playing the Hanzo, really taking full force of that. But it was weird because you're going into Morning Stars, who heavy Brigitte team. So that means that almost like the Winston's jumping in, Brigitte's got the net out to catch the Winston, catch him up and put him in a cage over here, just like he was on the moon. So that was kind of unfortunate, but it looked like Northern Lights came out, and the monkey managed to break out the cage in the end.
Animal cruelty. PETA set him free. It was a conspiracy. Nah. Yeah, it's a good point, Blank. I mean, on paper, it seems like it would have been a lot closer of a matchup, right? And I think originally when we look at winners finals, there may have been one of the reasons that it may have been closer was a slight, a sprinkling of hubris from Northern Lights. For example, Volskaya, we saw Casper, who showed himself to be, not only a great Pharah player, but also a great Widowmaker, was kind of on the Junkrat, you know, just spamming around. Perhaps the team wasn't playing quite as disciplined as I believe Samsung actually held Northern Lights 2-1 on Volskaya. So as opposed to what we saw coming into the grand finals, we did end up going to Volskaya, the same map, and there the story was a little bit different, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about Volskaya here on Winners Finals. Northern Lights came out of first point A with 6 minute 35. They should have really taken second point pretty easily, right? They just save up the ultimates, get that big Dragon Strike Graviton combo, but it never came to fruition. And then we come into the grand finals after Samsung Blue have already been playing for about 2 hours longer than Northern Lights at this point.
Yeah.
Northern Lights had a little bit of time to take a slushy break over there, and it looks like these guys are a little bit out of gas. Unfortunately, they managed to take the first game despite this, and I think that's more down to Northern Lights not being quite warm yet because they hadn't played for a little while. But after that, Samsung Blue's fatigue started to really kick in.
Yeah, I think Samsung Blue were kind of struggling with some player issues too. I think one of their tanks wasn't feeling very well. They had to take a break so that he could get a little air and everything. And so, yeah, it was definitely the match schedule kind of wearing on Samsung. That was a little bit unlucky. Northern Lights, though, they certainly learned from the mistakes in the previous matchup against Samsung and didn't repeat it. I personally really liked seeing the double sniper with Riverboat on the Hanzo and Casper on the Widowmaker playing at range, right? So very multifaceted heroes, and especially against the Brigitte that they know that Samsung is going to be running. Keeping the team at distance is a really good way to try and approach that, because Brigitte, her main strength is in brawling, and if you can try and get the picks whittle down the shield before they can even engage on the point, you're doing pretty good.
Yeah, and to that same effect with the double sniper, we were talking about this earlier, Ham, was that when they try to force these fights, oftentimes everyone on Northern Lights would use their movement reposition abilities. They've got obviously boosters on D.Va, leap on Winston. Hanzo has that tiny leap now as well. It's not as big as Winston's, but you can still get a good foot out of the way. Lunge. Yeah, dude, he's been doing some squats, but it's good. He gets him out of the way, and also you got 8-second cooldown on that grapple hook with the Widow, so she gets out of the way pretty quickly, repositions. And then once the crossfire was in full effect, that's when Latex starts to use his main tank ability that he's so good at disengaging and re-engaging. He knows exactly when to go back in. And we saw some great moments come out of it because of that. And it was just difficult for that Brigitte to really get in and make the brawl happen, because when she got there, no one was there.
Yeah, everybody's dead. And she really, I mean, Brigitte, right? Her pass, you don't want to be relying on like the repair packs to heal. You really want to be getting that passive going, but you can really only do that. The range, the AoE is pretty small, and you can only do that if you're doing damage. So she wants to be constantly engaged in some kind of fight, right? Line Pro in particular is a really aggressive frontline Brigitte, always like trying to make openings and stuff. But with the dive, the disciplined dive, I think coming out from Northern Lights is so hard to find anybody. They're all just hiding, right? And then suddenly the burst comes through. The Hanzo is like on some off angle and throws the dragons in, and you're like, oh, and then you just die. Yeah. So
a nice game of cat and mouse.
Well, you guys mentioned. Oh.
It's all right. It's just a game of cat and mouse, really. Like, Brigitte is not able to find it. I was just going to take a quick moment to talk about Line Pro's Brigitte, just because.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask, actually.
You
read my mind.
So good. Psychic. So, LemonKiwi, to the question that you were just about asked, that I read it in your mind. Brigitte on Line Pro, it's a very interesting way that he plays it. Plays it aggressively. But the thing that struck me most was the way he uses rally. Now, most Brigittes, they get one rally in a fight, and then they make their way up to the second one, so they have it for when the enemy team re-engages, right? So you have that extra armor, and obviously we're playing Zarya and Zenyatta, so they have it over the top of the shields. And having a player like Exaraf, who's an amazing Zenyatta, who plays very solidly on the side of Northern Lights, if he can give that extra armor and stay in the fight even longer, he was getting Transcendence every 45 seconds. But enough of that, we'll talk about Line Pro's Brigitte. He uses rally aggressively and often gets 2 in one fight. Now, you obviously get extra speed, but you fling that flail around a lot quicker. So one time, me and Hammer, we saw like Brigitte go straight in on 2 of a DPS and a support on Oasis and go really hard and pick up both the kills. Now, when a Brigitte by herself can pick up 2 kills, obviously the fight's always going to go in favor.
Yeah, no kidding. That's like a man advantage you can't really man advantage you can't really overcome if you're the side of Samsung or excuse me, Northern Lights. But yeah.
And you guys talked about Line Pro though on Brigitte, and someone that kind of struck me as Someone that stood out to me was Casper, and the amount of times he played Pharah on maps that I actually don't see Pharah commonly on. So do you guys think that he was a little bit too stubborn, or did the team make the Pharah work?
I thought that the Pharah actually worked out pretty well. I can remember specifically on King's Row Streets phase going into third point, Casper brought out the Pharah. Other times a little bit fuzzy, but I think it actually worked out pretty well. And we're talking about kind of the history of these teams, maybe what's the difference between Samsung and Northern Lights. Samsung, they have a lot of really good individual players, but Northern Lights, this is actually a really seasoned team. The vast majority of these players come from previous teams, and so have experience working in like different metas with different players who may have, other strengths and weaknesses and stuff. And I think their main thing is understanding the game very well, top tier game sense, because Casper's Pharah on Streets phase, correct me if I'm wrong, Blank, but I remember he brought it out when the cart was getting a little bit stopped up on Streets. So what do you want to do if you can't be pushing through that very narrow alleyway? You can take a different route of engagement, right? So he went up to the air. Pharah, he knew that I think Samsung was running like Brigitte Hanzo with Big One on the Hanzo, who's, Big One is a good Hanzo player, but that's a lot of pressure on a single hero, and they knew that Brigitte couldn't really do anything against the Pharah in the air, and so they're just farming up to the barrage, and it worked out quite well. So it's kind of an understanding of like the weaknesses of the enemy teams. Maybe this isn't our personal favorite or strongest comp, but we know how to play against them.
Blank, did you have anything to add about the Pharah?
I think, again, just straight to Ham's point, is that even though it's not their most optimal comp, this is something the Northern Lights did extremely well, as they adapted. And you see that throughout the entirety of Northern Lights games during Open Division, a lot of times when they drop only 1 to 2 matches, most of the time only 1 if they did drop 1 at all. And I think that comes down to their ability to adapt all the time. So you come into a match versus Brigitte, I think a lot of these guys, when they're coming through, when it's Samsung Blue, we'll throw it back to them, when they're going through their playoffs, a lot of the games are 3-2s, 3-1s, very scrappy games. I think that comes down to the Brigitte comp just about coming on top, but not quite adapting to their opponent. I think they definitely have a lot that they can improve on, but at the moment, they're still a very solid team, so you still need to watch out for the Contenders Trials.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Dance, right? Dance, his Zen is a fragger, so he was often able to, like the fight is ending, and you see like 3 Zen kills come through, you're like, all right, well, I guess that's done, right? So, a lot of potential, I totally agree.
Well, Right, and to wrap up Open Trials now Open Division, to go into Trials now, and a question I want to ask you guys is about the patch differences between Open Division playoffs and going into Trials. So, Trials will be played on patch 1.22. For everyone that doesn't know, that's Scatter Arrow Hanzo and Unnerved Brigitte. And of course, claiming that, I think I touched upon this in my last interview, due to instability of the newer patches on the Tournament Realm server. So how much of an impact do you think this will have on Open Division teams versus the Contenders Trials teams?
You want to take this one first, or
I'll take this one. I guess I'll have it. Okay. Pass it over to me.
Anyone go first. Don't fight.
No fighting here. No playground fighting. It's all good. I actually took the moment to talk to some of the teams about this. Actually, I got in contact with both Justifarian from Augmented Authority, and also had time to talk to Horfic as well. So both these guys, the thing they talked about the most was actually scrim time. So less about this on nerf, because obviously they're not sure how drastic the 150 armor and that 4-second cooldown on the stun will be, but they know that their first game is going to be extremely short on the OPR server, so they're going to take all the time they can and make as much valuable scrim time as possible. They're going to have to start thinking about focusing on strategic ways to counter Brigitte, so that's things that can be ever present in their mind. But we saw players like Riverboat, right, Ham, who are on Hanzo. He's an amazing Hanzo, and they won't have that same Storm Bow and the massive ability to build up so much ult charge so quickly. So I have to see how that pans out.
Yeah, I think the patch will. I mean, scrim time. That's a really good point. I mean, the players are always going to be cognizant of how much, because like we're theory crafting over here. Unfortunately, we're not actually pro players. But so the practical experience of actually playing the patch that you're going to be competing on is super important. But I think broadly speaking, it'll probably affect the different teams depending on what kind of comps they like to run. Like Blank said, Riverboat is a stupendous Hanzo. And a lot of what Northern Lights were able to get done was, based off of these kind of like flanks that he would go for, setting up crossfires, really good dragon strikes, and so on. So not to have that tool in your arsenal is probably going to be a little bit handicapping. On the flip side, though, for teams like Samsung Blue, unnerfed Brigitte is going to be a huge boon for Line Pro, give him, even more ability to make plays, make room for his team with that aggression.
Well, I think you guys wrapped that question up with a bow, and I now want to go to a more positive question on, well, of course, congratulations to Northern Lights and the other top 3 of Morning Stars, 1 point and Augmented Authority. The top 4 get to go to trials, but from Open Division playoffs that we saw on broadcast, who were some standout players or some star players that we should give an MVP trophy to in your eyes? Blank, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to take the Xenias here. So actually, these are both guys from the TT. I was sorry, I love that. I love the support. So these are the guys from Northern Lights and Samsung Blue. So you got Dance on Samsung Blue and Exaraf on Northern Lights. I think this is a really interesting combo because it's 2 ways you can look at Zenyatta and see completely different playstyles. So Exaraf's a very defensive Zenyatta. When it comes down to crunch time, he will take you down if you're Winston coming after him, but he plays a lot more defensive, knows where to keep that Orb of Harmony on people, and then uses the Disc Orb very aggressively. Also, Dance, on the other hand, likes to pretend he's Widowmaker and manages to get these hits from like across the globe, which is crazy. So it's around the world in 80 days with Dance on the Zenyatta.
He used to be a DPS player, right?
He used to. So you can see it.
Well, that's where that comes from.
So you can see where those remnants are. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on these guys, and definitely you guys at home can look at how those 2 different playstyles pan out.
And Ham, how about you?
Since Blank is pandering to the support crowd already, I'm gonna have to pander to the tank crowd. I'm just kidding. Tanks and supports, we already, I feel like the DPS, Wayfast, Danid, Riverboat, Casper, they're already getting plenty of glory through all of our excited outcasting. So we'll just touch upon kind of, 2 of the off tanks in particular to me that stood out, Brucin and Twells, actually, who wasn't in the grand finals, but still both of them really, really solid Zarya play and Diva play, not just like in terms of cooldown management, positioning, bumping mercies to stop reses, that kind of thing, but clutch Diva bombs to Twalls. I mean, it's all one big Diva bomb at this point. I feel like I've seen so many of his bombs like clutch out plays at 2-3K, right? So anytime you can have a Diva who's like has like the Poco effect or like the Note effect or any of the great Divas, right? That's like an extra threat that you bring to the playing field. And so those 2, definitely keep an eye on them.
Well, I'm glad you guys highlighted support players and tank players. I have totally agree that the DPS, especially Hanzo's, get so much love with how many times you see them in the kill feed. But that will wrap up our interview. And this was for the Open Division EU playoffs. And that was Evie and that was Blank. And thank you guys so much for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
All right, well, that will conclude Overwatch Contenders Daily, guys. Thank you so much for watching the episode. Make sure you check out HamTornado and Blank, because they're going to continue to cast Open Division and actually other things into the community. But that will wrap up this week, and hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.